see individual neurons light up as they fire. And what this gives us, the graphic, sorry, came out kind of weird. Oh, there we go. Is that we now have the activity from hundreds, thousands of neurons in the brain over time. So we have very large scale neural recordings, and we want to be able to extract what is the information shared amongst these neurons. How do different brain regions encode stimuli? How do they produce behavior? How do they generate long-term effects like memory and learning and so on? And a popular tool known to many of us in order to analyze large-scale high-dimensional data sets is manifold learning. So in manifold learning, we want to learn nonlinear representations of low-dimensional data, where our assumption is that despite the data being observed in high dimensions, so despite every data point having a very large number of features, which can number in the hundreds, thousands, and so on, the intrinsic dimensionality of the data is actually much smaller than that. So the data actually lies on some kind of low-dimensional manifold in this feature space. And we want to be able to recover this representation while we preserve certain geometric properties. And a few techniques rely, for example, on constructing a graph on the data and then embedding the data with a top eigenvector. So for example, the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix for PCA, or variants of the graph Laplacian for Laplacian eigenmaps and diffusion maps. And in neuroscience, using these techniques, we're able to study things like how an animal performing a certain task, how the representation of that task or clustering of that task differs between two different brain regions, or what the topology of neural activity looks like in different circuits. So here is a circuit in which we study animals' heading direction. So in what direction is the animal facing, and that topology lies on the ring. Or for example, in these two papers, they were studying navigation of an animal in a space, and how does the brain encode representation of that space? So what does the neural activity look like? So I've mentioned the word manifold multiple times now. What is a manifold? So mathematically, it's a topological space that locally resembles Euclidean space near each point. So locally, it is flat, and in one dimensions, this can be a line or a ring. And in 2D, we're familiar with, for example, a plane, the surface of a ball, a sphere, or the surface of a torus. And most of us, if we go outside, we're all walking around on a manifold, which is the surface of the Earth. So if I was to step outside my building here, I don't notice the curvature of the Earth. Everything is locally flat. And if I navigate across campus, then distances are locally Euclidean. But if I was to zoom out into the city of San Diego and zoom further out into the United States, then as I take distances along the Earth and the curvature, the shape of this manifold, this geometry start to play a role as I want to navigate from here to Europe, for example. Distances are no longer strictly Euclidean. And given the surface of the Earth, we want, for example, to reduce its dimensionality and embed it in its intrinsic dimensions. So we'd want to embed it in 2 dimensions. And cartographers have been dealing with this kind of embedding issue for many, many years, where different projections of the Earth into a 2-dimensional map incur various types of distortion. So they're preserving different geometric properties as they create different types of maps. Another issue related to manifold learning that we'll address in this talk is if, for example, we are given a map, a 2-dimensional map of the Earth, then one can ask, what is the original shape that this map came from? Is the Earth indeed a sphere or an ellipsoid, or do we actually all live on flat Earth? How do we know if we're just given the 2-dimensional map? So we'll attempt to answer this question as well today. So in terms of manifold learning frameworks, we make a distinction between two kinds. And the first one is the popular one, which is the top-down manifold learning framework. In this case, we have some global embedding of the data, like I mentioned, many times given by an eigen-T composition, but sometimes also through an optimization solution. And then an optional aspect of these techniques is that you can refine it iteratively by minimizing some measure of local distortion. And this, for example, is what UMAP does in this embedding of the Swiss roll. They first initialize it with a spectral approach, they add noise, and then they iteratively refine it to try to unravel the Swiss roll. In this talk, we're going to be focusing on bottom-up manifold learning frameworks. And in this framework, we first calculate local views with low distortion for data points. And then we're going to solve an alignment problem in order to get a global embedding. So one version of this is LTSA from Zhang. And we've developed two techniques for this, which I'll be talking about today, LDLE and RATS. And in this approach, we have our local views and we iteratively solve our refinement problem in order to get a global embedding that has low distortion. And I'll define what distortion is and how we achieve low distortion in our embeddings. So one of the things we wanted to be able to do in this work was to embed data in its intrinsic dimension. So as I mentioned, a ring is a one-dimensional manifold. It has only one parameter, which is the angle, but many times with manifold learning techniques, in order to recover it, you need 2 dimensions to recover a closed circle. Similarly, if you have a closed curve in higher than 2 dimensions, and a sphere, while having only 2 parameters that define it, will be embedded in 3 dimensions. What happens if you use common manifold learning techniques and try to embed, for example, a sphere or a torus in their intrinsic dimension, which is 2? So what will happen using, for example, LTSA or UMAP or Laplacian eigenmap is that when you embed it in its intrinsic dimension, the embedding technique will collapse the geometry on itself. We'll talk about t-SNE a bit later, what happens with t-SNE. And this incurs a lot of distortion in the embedding. So for example, the North Pole and the South Pole are far away from one another, but if I use a technique like UMAP in order to project the sphere down into 2 dimensions, then suddenly these points are right on top of each other. So 2 points that were far away in the ambient space and my measurement space are suddenly very, very close to each other in the embedding space if I try to embed an intrinsic dimension. So let's talk a bit about the definition of local distortion and how we can use that in order to evaluate the quality of manifold learning. So distortion, one of the definitions, is the product of the worst case expansion and contraction of distances, pairwise distances, between the embedding space and the ambient space in which the data is observed. And this measure of distortion is translation and rotation invariant, and it's also scale invariant. So if I have here a small ball or circle of radius 1, if I just scale it, then there is no distortion incurred in the pairwise distances between my data and my embedding. But if on the other hand, it is now expanded into ellipse along 1 dimension, then I have high distortion and I can have even higher distortion. Distortion will be equal to 1 if and only if the distances in the embedding space are just some constant scaling of the distances in the ambient space for all the points. And this is the ideal scenario. Taking the data and embedding it into low dimension doesn't introduce any distortions of pairwise distances. So what happens with some common manifold learning or data visualization techniques? The slide on t-SNE is actually a bit outdated, but using a random initialization for t-SNE, which used to be the default setting, t-SNE would take a common manifold like this high aspect ratio rectangle and break it up into these little tiny strips. And this causes high distortion where the strips have been ripped apart because distances are suddenly large with respect to one another, even though they were adjacent to one another in the data space. And in UMAP, in many cases where you have these situations of high aspect ratio, then UMAP will create these folds in the embedding space. This isn't cherry-picked. We've ran 100 of these, and in almost all cases, you get this kind of twist. And this twist also introduces high distortion in the embedding distances get warped with respect to which points are close to one another. So we're aiming to address these issues of distortion, embedding into intrinsic dimension, and also being able to then recover what is the original topology despite having embedded into intrinsic dimension. And we're going to start our bottom-up manifold learning framework by constructing local views of the data that have low distortion. So just as a kind of illustration of this part of the technique, we start out with our data that lies on some kind of manifold. We've observed it in a high dimension. And for every point now, we're going to calculate a local view. So we're going to take its local neighborhood. And for every local neighborhood, we're going to find a low distortion parameterization of that neighborhood, a low distortion representation. And we can do this in two ways. We can either use PCA locally within this neighborhood, or kernel PCA if we want to use a non-Euclidean metric. Or as I'll discuss in the next few slides, we can also take the Laplacian eigenvectors in order to define locally a low distortion parameterization of our local neighborhood. So this work builds on a paper from Jones, Maggioni, and Schul from 2007, which was universal local parameterizations via heat kernels and eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. And in this paper, they proved a theorem in which they showed that you can find low distortion parameterizations of small metric balls on a Riemannian manifold by using subsets of global eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. So for every metric ball, you can identify some subset of the global eigenfunctions of the Laplacian on this manifold. These are specific to the point itself, so the choice of eigenfunctions changes depending on which metric ball you belong to on the manifold. These parameterizations have low distortion. So you can find this representation such that it's by Lifshitz. And they had a construction procedure in the continuous case. You take a set of candidate eigenfunctions, you choose some arbitrary direction P1, and then you choose one of the eigenfunctions such that its gradient, the dot product between that gradient and this arbitrary direction, is small. So the gradient of this eigenfunction and this arbitrary P1 are more or less pointing in the same direction. And now you're going to iteratively choose and add more and more eigenfunctions such that their gradients are orthogonal to the previous eigenfunctions that have been chosen. So this motivates the choice of selecting gradients of eigenfunctions out of a subset of our Laplacian eigenfunctions so that they're locally orthogonal. And one of the challenges that we had is this estimation of the dot product of the gradient at a point and this arbitrary direction in the discrete case. Because what Jones, Maggioni, and Schul provide are an algorithm in the continuous case, and we wanted to bring it into the real data case for discrete points. So the first thing that we do is instead of having an arbitrary direction, we can actually select the gradient of one of the eigenvectors of our data. So we're moving from eigenfunctions to eigenvectors. And we need to be able now to estimate the inner product between the gradients of two eigenvectors at a point. And in order to do this, we did a numerical estimation of local correlation based on prior work by Stefan Steinerberger in 2017 and 2018. So what Stefan showed is that you can calculate the local correlation between two eigenfunctions at a point and for a given scale using the fundamental solution of the heat equation on the manifold. And then in our paper, we got a discrete estimate of this by a finite sum approximation of the given integral, which in the limit then gave us the inner product between the gradients of the eigenvectors at a point. So we can now use this in order to find subsets of eigenvectors that are orthogonal, that are locally orthogonal to each other at a point. So just on the unit square, we actually can show this, that our numerical estimate matches the analytical estimate of these gradient dot products. And from this, we now build our algorithm. I'll go over just the first few steps, but for the full details, you can read our paper published at JMLR. So we start out with a very large number of eigenvectors. We have 100 or so. This is very different than what is common knowledge in manifold learning, where you typically only select the first few eigenvectors. Here we're going to select subsets of eigenvectors out of a large set of eigenvectors so that the subsets can change depending on where we are in the data. So we start out with some candidate eigenvectors that have a large gradient at the point. So we're going to do this for every point in the data set based on its local neighborhood. We choose a low frequency eigenvector, so one that has a small eigenvalue. And then we use our approximation of the inner product between the gradients of the eigenvectors in order to choose our first initial eigenvector, I1. So this is the first direction that has a large gradient at this point. And then we're iteratively going to add, depending on what dimensionality we want, more and more eigenvectors such that they're locally orthogonal at this point, using our estimation of the inner product of the gradients of the eigenvectors. And we're choosing them so that they have a low frequency, so that they're varying smoothly at this point. So let's see what this looks like. Again, going back to this toy example on the unit square. We are looking at this local neighborhood here, this tiny square at the center of the square. We've selected phi 8 as our initial eigenvector. This is what it looks like on the square. And then using our technique, the next eigenvector that's selected is this one. And you can see that for these black points, we indeed get a representation that has low distortion. So we have a nice grid layout of the points that belong to this local neighborhood. And if I was to randomly select, kind of see what would happen with a different choice, either the 15th eigenvector or the 14th eigenvector, then we can see that these black points kind of all collapse on one another, and I do not have a low distortion representation of this neighborhood on the unit square. And this is just a bit of an addition. So in certain cases, for some of the data sets, we know if our data set has a boundary, if our manifold has a boundary, and we're able to further reduce distortion by using a doubled manifold. So using eigenvectors of the double manifold rather than a regular manifold representation. And this reduces the local distortion of all the neighborhoods, in this case, within the unit square. And in general, what does this look like then? We had our data on the manifold, we constructed our Laplacian, we had a very large group of eigenvectors from the graph Laplacian, and we've now selected locally subsets of eigenvectors in order to get a representation for every local neighborhood in the data. So what you can see here in the visualization, the neighborhood is going to pop around on the unit sphere. And for every neighborhood, we get a different selection of pairs of eigenvectors that are locally orthogonal and give us a low distortion representation. So you can see what these eigenvectors look like depending on where we are. So that's for our local neighborhood low distortion representation based on this theorem from Jones, Maggioni, and Schul to get a low distortion representation. I see there are questions in the chat. or the locally linear tangent space based on corresponding PCA assumption due to computational demand of nonlinear geometric learning and PGA. So the motivation for doing our local neighborhood representations is that we have this guarantee in the continuous case of getting low distortion representations on small neighborhoods. And then the next phase of the algorithm, as I go into the next part of the talk, is now given these low distortion representations, how do we stitch them all together in order to get a global embedding of the data when I've started out with having different representations depending on where I am. So we have our local views, and we now want to get a global embedding of our data set. So for every point, we have its local neighborhood. And then we are going to lay these out and stitch them together based on overlaps between the neighborhoods themselves. So I can use these green points that are shared between two different views in order to align them to each other. And if I do this for all the neighborhoods in the data set, then I will get a global embedding of the data. And I want to get this embedding so that I'm still preserving the low distortion that I had in the local views. So just as a small kind of heuristic, if we have very small local views, then aligning all of these data sets becomes a very noisy process and also computationally intensive. We describe in the paper a clustering approach that we have in order to group the local neighborhoods into slightly larger, what we call intermediate views. And this solves the problem of the high computational complexity of solving an alignment problem over all the views, and also gives us larger overlaps between views, making our estimation of the alignment more robust. And the clustering itself is a procedure so that we are preserving the low distortion in our representation as we go from the local views to the intermediate views. So you can see that the representations themselves still have low distortion and are approximately a nice grid in this case of the toy problem of the sphere. So we now have our reviews, and we want to be able to solve this global alignment problem so that we're preserving low distortion, and so that we'll be able to embed into intrinsic dimension, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. So graphically, we have views that were observed in the ambient dimension. In the local views, they can now lie in different places. They have different representations. And what we want to learn is some kind of rigid alignment, so a rotation and translation, so that the views align, so that the points on the overlap have as small as error as possible, so that they're as close to each other as possible in the two representations. So we're trying to solve an optimization problem of this form. And we want to solve it under two conditions. So one condition is that the manifold itself has a boundary. Going back to the example of the plane, or if you have data that is clustered, for example. But another case is that many times, and I'll show this later in the talk, we can observe manifolds that don't have a boundary. So these are closed manifolds. And how do we embed them in intrinsic dimension when the manifold is closed? So in this case, for example, these red and blue views both overlap this green view here, but they also overlap the cyan view here. If I wanted to solve this alignment problem so that I was minimizing the error both with respect to these points and with respect to these points, then everything would kind of collapse in the center. So let's see how we solve this problem. The idea that we have is that we start out with what we call an over-torn embedding. So we're going to use a tree representation in order to lay out all of our local views. And then we're going to stitch our views back together in an iterative manner. So we're iteratively going to align views to each other, but we only align views who are neighbors in both the ambient space and in the embedding space. And I'll show you what that means on the next slide. What we end up with is that for closed and also non-orientable manifolds like the Klein bottle, a tear will be retained. So we'll be able to rip the manifold apart and lay it out flat, as for example, embedding the Earth into a two-dimensional map. While for other manifolds that, for example, have a boundary, the tear will vanish automatically by solving this optimization problem iteratively. So the way we solve this, we model a bipartite graph between points in our views and the views themselves based on the overlap of the points to the views. We can rewrite our optimization problem as solving for the set of transformations of rigid alignments between the local views. And we start out with our over-torn embedding. We have some kind of initial alignment between our local views. That gives us an embedding. And now we're going to update this graph of points between which points and which views overlap in the embedding space. And that leads us to a new rigid alignment solution, which gives us a new embedding from which we can now update again our bipartite graph for the points that are now neighbors in the embedding. So you can see as points are being stitched closer together, they become neighbors in the embedding, whereas previously they weren't. And if we repeat this iteratively, then we manage to kind of stitch together the manifold. But points that are far away in the embedding, even if they are neighbors in the ambient space, aren't stitched together because their edges are never included in this bipartite graph for which we are solving our optimization problem to align the views to each other. And I'll explain the colors along the boundary in a minute. So one question that we can have is what guarantees can we have on solving this kind of optimization problem and obtaining a global alignment solution? So in the noiseless case, we can define a perfect alignment that's unique up to an orthogonal transformation. And this optimal alignment is unique. So we have a sufficient condition for uniqueness, and we also have necessary and sufficient conditions for it to be non-degenerate. And we can also show that Riemannian gradient descent in solving this optimization problem converges locally linear to a non-degenerate alignment of our local views. And we have a paper up on arXiv that's under review that lays out the theory for this. In comparing different alignment algorithms to solve this problem of stitching the local views to each other to get a global embedding, we found that Riemannian gradient descent is the fastest that converges to the smallest alignment error. So we compared, for example, to Procrustes, to a spectral approach, to SDP. And across different types of manifolds and geometries and topologies, we find that Riemannian gradient descent always gives the best solution and converges the fastest. So here, for example, with the Swiss roll with a hole, Procrustes or the spectral solution to the alignment problem don't even converge to a nice solution, but rather preserve a tear in the embedding and aren't able to recover the flattened out Swiss roll. So what do we get with this tear-aware Riemannian alignment? What does it give us that we have this preservation of the tear and the ability to embed into intrinsic dimension? So we're able to take the sphere here, embed it into a dimension of 2, and we preserve the knowledge of which points along the boundary of our embedding where their neighbors are in the ambient space. So we color along the boundary, for example, that the points that are yellow here and the points that are yellow here are actually neighbors in the ambient space, even though in their embedding, they're far away from one another. And the blue points here are neighbors of the blue points here and the red here and so on. And what this gives us is a gluing diagram from which we can recover what is the original topology. It also allows us to define what we call a tear-aware teleportation distance. What does this mean? If I want to calculate the distance between these 2 points that were close to each other in the ambient space, if I want to calculate their distance in the embedding, I know that the distance, rather than traveling here from yi to yj within the interior of the embedding, the smaller distance is actually traveling here to the boundary and then teleporting to the other part of the boundary and then traveling to yj. This is similar to if you are sailing across the Pacific Ocean, you don't fall off the face of the Earth, but rather you keep sailing across the map here in order to reach Asia. So we have this distance, and here are some things that we can do with both this tear-aware embedding and with the distance itself. So I mentioned that we're able to recover the topology. So if we embed a closed manifold, such as a torus, into 2 dimensions, by tracking the variation of the colors along the embedding itself, we're able to say that this embedding in 2 dimensions does recover a torus, whereas a different gluing diagram, for example, if this arrow was switched in direction, would give us a Klein bottle. So I'm able to tell you, as in my original example, that we live on a sphere rather than living on flat Earth. We can recover what is the geometry that the embedding came from. Another thing that we can do with this is, for example, accelerate topological data analysis. So rather than calculating, for example, persistence homology over all the points in the data set, we can calculate the persistence homology on a graph that is just along the points on the boundary of the embedding and recover, for example, for the torus that we have 2 co-cycles, and this takes 21 seconds for this data set rather than 5 hours. So we've accelerated TDA. And this is visualizing the tear of this boundary on the idealized data set that it came from, and we can indeed identify the 2 rings making up the torus. So we started out with our low distortion local views. We've stitched them together iteratively. We recover our manifold embedding from which we're able to recover, in this case, it is a sphere based on its gluing diagram. And then to go into some results before I move on into our global distortion evaluation measure. So here again, some simple toy problems. Some of these have holes, for example. We could think of this as missing data. Some of these are noisy. And for our low distortion local eigenmaps, we can see that we're best able to both preserve geometry of the holes. We don't curve the embedding in various ways as UMAP does, and we're able to handle noise. So one question is, how do we evaluate the qualities of embeddings? And I showed you earlier using local distortion in order to identify locally where distances have been distorted. But we designed a new measure in order to evaluate whether the geometry of the manifold is preserved in low dimensions. So for local views or local distortion, what we can look at is the product of the worst case expansion and contraction of pairwise distances between the embedding and geodesics in the ambient space. And we have that our bottom-up manifold learning constructs local views with low distortion. But what can we say about the distortion of the global embedding, both for the way we've designed it and also for general manifold learning techniques? So we have derived 2 different measures, which we call weak and strong global distortion. And what they look at is, rather than pairwise distances between points, they look at the geodesics. So we look at paths in both the ambient space and the embedding and see whether these paths are distorted as we go from the high dimensional ambient space to the low dimensional embedding. So for the weak global distortion, we take our path. So for example, here between xi and xj, we calculate the geodesic. And then we take the same sequence of points as we had in the high dimensions, recover that same sequence in the low dimensions, and see whether this path has contracted or expanded. And we use this in order to define a pointwise version of global distortion. A stronger measure of this is what we call strong global distortion. In this case, we'll take both the shortest path in the embedding space and the shortest path in the ambient space. So on the sphere in the ambient space, we have this red path, but once we've embedded and collapsed in this case, the shortest path in the embedding space is actually this blue path. And we can see that it is greatly contracted with respect to the ambient dimension. So we can evaluate these pointwise for all points in our data set and get a distribution of the strong and weak global distortions. And we can use this to now compare different embeddings to each other. So take, for example, this path. We've embedded it in two different ways, and we want to compare it to each other and determine which one has smaller distortion and which one is a better representation of the path. And when we compare these two to each other, we can see that for this second embedding, where there's only a tiny loop at the edge, the majority of the points have lower distortion, lower global distortion than for this first embedding, where the twist occurs in the center of the embedding. So the distribution is shifted towards higher distortion in this case. For weak distortion, since it's only recovering the paths from the high dimensions to the low dimensions, it actually turns out this has smaller weak distortion. So to evaluate, we're going to use strong distortion, but comparing the strong to the weak, we're able to determine when there has been a collapse, for example, in the embedding. So what can we do with this distortion? We can also achieve a bound on the distortion in the bottom-up manifold learning case. So our bound is that the global distortion is bounded by a function of both the maximum local distortion that we had locally in our paths and also the alignment error in doing our rigid alignment between local views to each other. This makes sense intuitively. The distortion in bottom-up manifold learning depends on both how much distortion you have in your local views and then how much error you've accumulated when you've done a rigid alignment of these views in order to recover the global embedding. For the weak global distortion, for the strong global distortion, we have an assumption in order to achieve this bound, and that is that consecutive points on every shortest path in the embeddings are neighbors in the data. So what does this look like visually? Every path that I have in the embedding, if I take consecutive points along this path, they need to be neighbors in the ambient space, okay? In order for there not to be high global distortion. The contrapositive of this means that distance points in the data need to be far away from each other in the embedding. And this leads us to have motivation for a repulsion term. So there's been a lot of interest lately in attraction and repulsion, in dimensionality reduction, especially in Tisny and UMAP, which could be viewed as lying on this attraction repulsion spectrum. And we get a condition for this via our bound on global distortion. So if the points are not neighbors in the data, then they shouldn't form a segment of any shortest path in the embedding. And we can add a term to ensure this when we solve our global alignment problem. So we're trying to align all local views to each other. And then for pairs of views that are far away from each other, we want them to lie far away in the embedding itself. So this is a repulsion term that we add to our optimization problem. This gives us an optimization objective that is very similar to the one that we had previously solved. And the only difference is we previously had a Laplacian of this bipartite graph, and it has now been augmented into being the difference between this bipartite graph and a second Laplacian that is between the pairs of points that are far away from one another. So we could think of this as a combinatorial Laplacian of a signed graph between pairs of points that are close to each other. looking at the relationships between pairs of points that are close to each other and pairs of points that should be far away in the embedding. And we can use the same kind of optimization algorithms in order to solve this alignment problem and get our registration of our local views. So just as an example, if we want to embed rather than in intrinsic dimension, if we wanted to embed a torus in 3-dimension, we start out with our initialization. And if we don't have a repulsion term and we try to embed a torus in this bottom-up manifold learning framework without repulsion, the torus kind of collapses in itself, as happened with other techniques. But if we add repulsion, you could think of this as kind of blowing up a balloon, and we are able to recover the topology of the torus. I mentioned finding kind of these interesting manifolds in the wild. So this is from a paper from Lederman and Talmon. They had a video of 2 dolls spinning with respect to one another. The dolls are spinning at different frequencies, so that the video of these 2 dolls actually lies on a torus in 2 dimensions. We're able to recover the topology of this torus using our gluing diagram, and doing alignment with repulsion, we're also able to recover this toroidal shape in 3 dimensions. Up until now, I've shown mostly embeddings of data sets that have an intrinsic dimensionality of 2. What if we go into higher intrinsic dimensions? So in this case, we have the embedding of a 3-sphere, so its intrinsic dimensionality is 3. We can embed it in 3D, and now the tear of this manifold is no longer a curve, but rather it is a surface, and we can still color the surface to show how it needs to be glued back together. So we can do alignment with repulsion in higher dimensions in order to get a glow embedding with low distortion and with tearing. And then looking at non-orientable manifolds, and we have a few more examples in the paper, also for a Mobius strip. But again, we went out to find kind of interesting manifolds in the wild. So this is the conformation space of a cyclooctane, and it turns out that this conformation space actually lies on a Klein bottle. We're able to embed it in 2 dimensions, and using the gluing diagram, recover that it is indeed the topology of a Klein bottle. This is what the embedding of a Klein bottle from 4 dimensions into either 3 dimensions or 2 dimensions looks like for competing methods and for our approach. So we can see that for Tisny and UMAP, they both have this kind of pinch where the Klein bottle intersects itself. Isomap, I'm not really sure what is going on there with that shape, but for rats, we're able to embed it into intrinsic dimension of 2, and again, indicate with the gluing diagram similar to this real world example that we have. This is embedding, I think, from a 26-dimensional data set. We're able to recover this Klein bottle topology with the lowest global distortion out of all the techniques. So how am I for time? I'm at the end. So I'll maybe show just 2 quick examples from neuroscience and go to the summary. So I mentioned earlier that we're recording very large-scale data sets in neuroscience and embedding these data sets in order to understand the representations of tasks in neural activity. What is the topology of neural activity? So just looking again at this example, we have a rat that is navigating what is called an open field, basically this square space. And they are recording from entorhinal cortex, which is part of the navigation circuit. The cells in this brain region are grids. They're called grid cells. And it's been shown in previous work in Gardner et al. That the activity lies on a torus. So we were able to take this high-dimensional data. It's, I think, about 120 neurons per time point. And we compare embedding with Tisny, UMAP, and Isomap, which sort of recover some kind of toroidal shape, with rats, which we're able to recover, again, using our gluing diagram that we have a toroidal shape here. And we can very quickly, as I mentioned before, apply topological data analysis to just the tear of the manifold in order to find that we have two co-cycles in our persistence homology diagrams. This is similar for heading direction. The neural activity lies on a ring, and we're able to find a one-dimensional embedding with low distortion. And then we're able to do this in more complicated tasks where, for example, the neural activity represents timing between two cues and execution of a task. I won't go into the details, but it's in a paper that we just submitted last week. Somebody asked earlier about motivation in the chat, and these neuroscience applications were one of our motivations for doing this kind of low distortion embeddings. When you have data set in which you're expecting to find that your observations reflect some kind of external variable with physical quantity, such as time or such as space, you want to know that you're not introducing any kind of artifacts into the embedding, because we want to be able to understand, in this case, in neuroscience, how well does the brain encode these kind of physical quantities of space and time. And when we have techniques such as t-SNE and UMAP that introduce distortions, distort pairwise distances, this harms our ability to do downstream analysis and decode our external variables to see how well the brain represents these. By preserving low distortion between the data and the embedding, then we have a better sense of what is truly being represented in our latent representations and in the data we've collected. So we show in this paper multiple examples in which having low distortion embedding also leads to better outcome in terms of downstream analysis and solving regression tasks to external variables and performing decoding from neural activity. So just as a summary, we developed different bottom-up manifold learning techniques where we use different local view constructions, either selecting subsets of the global eigenvectors of the Laplacian or using PCA or kernel PCA locally in order to get low distortion local views. We show how we align these views to each other in order to get an embedding that is global across our data set, and that we can solve this problem so that we can tear the embedding and embed it in intrinsic dimension while preserving the original topology via this gluing diagram. We design a new measure in order to determine the preservation of the geometry of the data in low dimensions and bound our global distortion measure as a function of both distortion in the local views and the error in the global embedding. And we show how this bound leads to the need for adding a repulsion term to the bottom-up manifold learning in order to push away points that are dissimilar in the ambient space, also in the embedding space. So I'd like to thank my collaborators, Drew, who's a PhD student with Alex and I, and our collaborators, Bas and Devika in the Netherlands, my group, various funding agencies, and all of you for showing up today.
All right. So thanks, Gail, for giving us the very nice talk. So so let's move on to the Q&A then. So in the chat, I think we got quite a few questions already. So do you want me to read out the
Yeah, I
question?
turned off the laser pointer, so now we can actually look at the chat.
Okay, cool.
What is the size of a local neighborhood? Do the results depend on the size of the neighborhood? Feel like off the top of my head, it was a few dozen points. So let's say 50 points, maybe. I know Drew did some initial ablation studies of this, but at some point just kind of fixed this number and we use that across data sets. How do we compute the geodesics? So in order to compute the geodesics, we construct a k-nearest neighbor graph on the data and use that in order to estimate the geodesics on the graph. Is the embedding space always assumed to be a Euclidean space? So in this case, we are embedding into a Euclidean space. We haven't looked into doing this for, I guess, hyperbolic spaces. But for a lot of the downstream tasks that people are performing, for example, like regression or prediction, there is a lot of time this kind of implicit assumption that you're embedding is in a Euclidean space. How to determine the intrinsic dimension. So sometimes you know what the intrinsic dimension is. Sometimes you want to discover it. There are ways to estimate intrinsic dimension. One of the things that we found is that you can calculate this embedding for an increasing dimension, and at the correct intrinsic dimension, our global distortion measure actually plateaus. So kind of using an elbow in the global distortion plot, you can determine what the intrinsic dimension is. I think that was all the questions, but happy to answer more.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, feel free to type questions into the chats. Well,
In the meanwhile, I will bring up this conference that is maybe of interest to people in
okay.
the seminar. So we have the SIAM conference on mathematics of data science towards the end of October this year at Atlanta. It's kind of past the submission deadline, but if you've not
Okay.
submitted, always be happy to see you there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I might have a question. So thanks, Gail, for the presentation. Can you think of other applications where this might be useful next to the neuroscience application?
Um, Yeah, I mean, any case in which you want to embed high dimensional data in low dimensions, right? I know there's interest in genomics in doing this. We have a collaborator in microbiome where they've been trying to do these kind of low distortion embeddings where they have kind of metrics that are actually non-Euclidean in the data space that are tailored to the microbiome application.
Is it
I
also
think
useful then for like building a classifier or something that you say, okay, I use these as my features of my, let's say,
yeah, I mean, the point is, right, not just
structure.
data visualization, but also that you can then do downstream analysis.
Right, right.
So you do
Yeah.
classification and you can do regression. I think one of the interesting things is designing an algorithm for these kind of tear-aware embeddings.
Mhm. Okay, okay. Yeah, thanks.
Hmm.
Sorry, so I guess also this is, I guess, a QR code to one of our papers. And this is a link to the code for those of you who are interested with playing around with it. I know Dhruv included many Jupyter notebooks of demos on various data sets.
Okay, thanks. I think we can wrap it up here then, no? To, what do you think?
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much for the invitation and good luck to everybody submitting to NERFs.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk and for being here also despite the deadline.
Yeah, I'm glad we managed to work it out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
so there's a question about the recording. So yeah, usually, so these recordings will be put on the YouTube channel of the Signal Processing Society. So if you go there and you search for the DEGA webinar series, then you will find the recordings. So,
yes.
okay, thanks.
All right.
So see you
Thanks.
all.